This next panel is operational views on Arctic shipping, so a 1-2 punch on the Arctic shipping, and it is moderated by SarahHarrison, Arctic Marine Transportation Specialist at the United States Committee on the Marine Transportation System. Sarah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, and good afternoon, everybody. As Mike said, my name is SarahHarrison, and I'm stepping in for my colleague, Dr. Allison Azara, who couldn't be with us today. And at this point in the conversation, we've sort of seen the Arctic from a 30,000-foot view. And what we're going to do for this panel is take a closer look at what it actually means to operate in the Arctic. What does it mean to plan and execute a voyage? And with me, I have an astounding lineup of experts with us. And I want to say that, yes, the sea ice is retreating, but planning and executing a voyage is far more than just avoiding the ice. So introducing my panelists, to my left is Mr. Tim Keane. He is the Senior Manager of Arctic Operations and Projects and Vice President of Infotech Technical Services, a division of FedNav Limited. His name is synonymous with expertise in Arctic navigation, and he began his career at FedNav on the operations side in 1977. And since 1997, Mr. Keane has been managing the commercial operations of the company's Arctic business line, including the commercial management of the company's ice-breaking bulk carriers. He also assumed responsibility of Infotech in 2010 to provide ice navigation support services to the company's vessels and outside operators. To his left is Mr. James Bond, who is the Director of Advisory Services at the American Bureau of Shipping, also known as ABS, located in Houston, Texas. An engineer by training and a fellow of the Society of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers, Mr. Bond currently focuses his work on polar shipping and Arctic offshore exploration. He's even spent time on the ice in the Canadian Beaufort Sea and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Mr. Bond represented the International Association of Classification Society, affectionately known as IACS, at the International Maritime Organization's negotiation for the Polar Code. And he is as a member of the IACS team, worked on updates to the polar ship structure rules. He's also serves as a chair of the IACS expert group for the Polar Code. In the middle here, we have Mr. Michael Kingston. He was the 2014 to 2015 Lloyd's List Global Maritime Lawyer of the Year for his contributions for the safety of life at sea, particularly in the polar reaches of the world, in relation to the risk and regulation of the Polar Code, which was just being finalized at that point in time. Mr. Kingston represented the International Union of Marine Insurance at the IMO's World Delegation Correspondence Groups in the final stages of the development of the ice regime that will guide limitations for operation on ice, following his earlier work as a specialist insurer with Lloyd's of London's Arctic Report. To his left is Ms. Ann Barker. She's an engineer with the Ocean, Coastal, and River Engineering portfolio at the National Research Council of Canada. As leader of the NRC's Arctic program, she is responsible for the delivery of relevant research outcomes to enable sustainable, low-impact resource development of the Arctic while increasing the quality of life for Canada's northernmost residents. And finally, at the very end of our panel, last but certainly not least, is Ms. Leslie Canavera. She is the CEO of Pole Arctic LLC, an oceanography and data science company focused on solving business challenges in the Arctic. And Pole Arctic is celebrating its 1-year anniversary today, so happy birthday to them. Ms. Canavera is UPIC and also a U.S. Air Force veteran with over 13 years of experience in both the public and private sector. And with that, giving an overview of what we have today, we have experts in classification, insurance, researchers of all types and varieties here. I'm going to ask each of them the same question and then open it up to discussion amongst us. And that question is, what does an operator need or need to know in order to operate safely in the Arctic? Tim, pass it to you.
Sure. Before I answer that, I just want to, I usually open up any presentation that we do, and perhaps it's a bit redundant for this crowd, but just to remind people that Arctic shipping is not new. It's been on the go for a long time. Our company alone has been up there for 60 plus years, having accomplished over 35 million tons of cargo carried, 900 voyages all executed safely. So have no fear. The shipping is in good hands, generally speaking. In answer to Sarah's question, and given that there are not many tall buildings in the Arctic, I'll give you the elevator pitch in terms of what's needed, is to be prepared. and that sums it up. In the marine industry, we refer to voyage planning, knowing where you're going, knowing how you're going to get there, knowing what you're going to encounter when you get there is incredibly important. It's of paramount importance. Before you even get to that stage, and something that's certainly the way that we operate in Canada and in the United States, is to ensure that the local component, the local people, are aware of the plans, and there is a buy-in from the local residents and users of the land. In our case, we operate year-round in the Arctic, so the land extends to the ice in the wintertime. So we spend some time ensuring that people locally have their chance to participate and have a say in how we are going to do the shipping. I think that sums up the elevator pitch portion of it.
Okay, my turn, I guess. And before I answer your question, I just state the reason why ABS is up here on the stage. We go back to the ABS mission, and our mission statement is quite simple. It's about promoting safe shipping and protecting safety of life at sea, assets at sea, and protection of the marine environment. And when I look at the overall arching goals of the Polar Code, there's basically perfect alignment. So the Polar Code's looking for provide safe shipping and protection of the environment. So that's why this is important to ABS and to me personally. Building them to answer Sarah's question, and it's a same theme as Tim has said. It's awareness and asking the shipping community, from our perspective, when we look at a polar water operation manual and the operational assessment that went ahead of that creation of the polar water operation manual, it's awareness of the environment, where you're going, what is the specific environment you're going to at the time of year, and then think about it. We just say think. It's a recurring theme just to ask people to really think about where they're going and what they're going to be doing, and what are the ramifications of the environment, and what are the ramifications of their impact potentially on that environment. So,
Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Just to echo what James and Tim have said, awareness is everything, but the foundation block for awareness is preparation and having the right framework in place. And I think it was Senator King earlier referenced a famous United States politician. I think he said Abraham Lincoln, who was asked, what had a certain amount of time. I think he said to cut either a tree or a wood down. And what did he go and do first? Well, he went and sharpened his axe for 15 minutes so that he could carry out his job properly. So he prepared and emphasized the need for preparation. And in order to prepare and do things properly in the Arctic, and speaking from an insurance industry point of view and having carried out reviews into the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, where preparation was not appropriate, and into the sinking of the Costa Concordia with 4,600 people on board in Italy, which was the same thing of a lack of preparation and too much risk. You need a framework in place, and you need proper rules and regulations. That was referenced by Admiral Ray, that you need a rule-based order, and you need, as Senator Murkowski said earlier, safety, reliability, and security. You need systems in place that are recognized, that can hopefully be encapsulated in regulation, which is why we've worked so hard to make the Polar Code fit for purpose. But then you have to go a step further. Rules are one thing, implementation's another, and it's why we've established the Arctic Shipping Best Practices Information Forum with the very hard work of the Arctic Council, including great leadership by the United States, so that we can implement those rules correctly and everyone understands, hopefully, the information that needs to be relied on, and approach it in a harmonized manner. From an insurance point of view, working as a lawyer that's advised Lloyd's of London, you can then ensure with certainty so that those such as Tim who have vast experience can go about their business, and those who aren't doing it properly are stopped with a clear framework in place.
Thank you. Anne, to you.
Sure. So I'll maybe take from a research perspective how we see, I guess, maritime operations. They need tools and products and technologies that really help add value in order to provide operations that are safe, efficient, maybe save energy, provide safety both in terms of navigation as well as environmental protection when we're operating in an Arctic environment in particular. And those tools all need both relevant and also defensible data behind their creation, and those are important. And we do talk a lot about long-term monitoring of environment and things like that, but we also need a way to operationalize that data and bring it into a design context, into a planning context, as well as an operational context. Because by doing that, we can do meaningful analysis to make sure that we're supporting sound risk-based assessments before you're going out there. It's supporting decision-making, and then from a federal perspective, we're also supporting sound science-based policy decisions as well as regulations for maritime operations.
Thank you. And Leslie, final question to you. What does an operator need to operate safely in the Arctic?
So I think this is the worst part about being last on a distinguished panel is everyone's already given the great answers. So I'm going to build on that a little bit. Like you said, Sarah, I'm from a near Canadian state called Alaska. So I've been informed to say A.
Because we're doing the Canadians on the stage?
So to build on what the other panelists said is I think the important thing that we need to have is the information and the data to do it right the first time. Because the important thing with the environment and the people and everything up there in that fragile ecosystem is we can't afford to do it wrong and have catastrophe. So being able to have the data, the tools to be able to support the logistics and the planning is paramount to being able to operate safely in the maritime Arctic. And so one of the things that we like to say at Polarctic is for Arctic maritime operations, you are literally between a rock and a hard place. When you're looking at the navigational charts for the Arctic, it's 4.1% of the United States Arctic, and I believe 28% of the Canadian Arctic is mapped to navigational standards. So with coastal erosion, with rocks, with different things that could pop up for hazards, that you literally could have a rock and then the hard place being the sea ice. So the being able to forecast that and understand those risks are going to be critical.
Thank you so much. And hearing all of that that you laid out for us, Leslie, about the challenges of working in the Arctic, I want to turn to our operator on our panel, Tim, and I want to ask you, you mentioned Arctic navigation is not new, and FedNav has a long and distinguished history operating in the Arctic safely. And there have been a few recent passages of the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route bulk carriers undertaken by FedNav. And I was just wondering if you could talk us through some of the decision-making points that you made behind those voyages.
Just a point of clarification, we have not done the Northern Sea
you've
Route.
not. My apologies.
But we did do the Northwest Passage in 2014, and following up on a theme that's been repeated here and in the previous presentation, it was destinational shipping, the difference being the origin of the cargo was northern Quebec and the destination was China. And so in 2014, all the stars aligned in as much as the ice conditions. From earlier presentations, you will have noted that September month is when the ice is at the minimum sea ice extent. However, most importantly, we had a ship that was a polar class ship that would have been able to withstand any type of ice conditions that she encountered, and we had a very well trained captain and ice navigator and a very, very competent crew. Again, preparation, knowing what you're getting into. just digressing a few, I remember years and years ago, a captain of a ship came into Montreal and claiming to be completely prepared because he had warming capacity for his ship, for his crew members, and the warming capacity was deep heating rub. So we called him Captain Ben Gay. Those days are gone, courtesy of the Polar Code, IMO, voyage planning, ISM. The notion of the deadliest catch and the cold water cowboys in terms of commercial shipping is gone, and the ships that are going up there are prepared, horses for courses. They're prepared for what they're going to encounter.
Sarah, can I make a comment just on
Yes, you may.
what Tim has just said? Because one thing that I found incredibly reaffirming from the historic voyage of the Nunavik was that when the Nunavik went through the Northwest Passage, she did not return through the Northwest Passage because of the experience and decision-making by those back at home in conjunction with the master, which demonstrated proper decision-making. Because, and I'll let you explain this very quickly, Tim, it was late in the year and there wasn't the same support up north, so the operational decision was, we'll go the long way around, even though the ship was perfectly capable in the ice conditions to withstand them. Remoteness was an issue, so they made a sensible decision in the boardroom and at master level to take the ship the long way around, and that is a real example of safety and proper approach to voyage planning, and the sort of thing when you see that it instills confidence in the insurance industry and in the decision-making process when operators with vast experience are making sensible decisions and not taking risks.
Yeah, and I mean, you did it better than I could have, and one of the best pieces of advice I ever got early in my career when faced with a decision of what to do it wasn't necessarily an Arctic thing, but the senior person in our shop said, act like the prudently uninsured. So if you have no insurance, don't fall into a moral hazard of doing things just because you're covered. It's your ship. I work for a private company. It's our ship, and we treat it that way, and we make sure that we don't put people in peril for
a fast buck.
Exactly.
Thank you both. James, I want to turn the question to you of what is the role that classification societies play in determining whether a vessel can navigate in the Arctic?
We have the most of the classification societies, well, pretty much all of them, all the IX members are what are termed recognized organizations. So we act on behalf of the flag states. So we're issuing polar ship certificates on behalf of flag. To date, just to give you an idea, I think we're probably around 250 issued for polar ship certificates. That's worldwide, and it's a distribution based on who has the most ice class ships. We've issued, we're up to about 30 from ABS. So we have the responsibility of reviewing the operational assessment, the polar water operation manuals that are mandatory processes and documents that have to be on board the ships. And then we issue the polar ship certificates. The polar ship certificates list the limitations for the specific limitations for the ship. So whether that's its low temperature operations, what equipment's on board for sustaining life and search and rescue and survivability, and what temperatures those are rated to. So we'll put a limitation on the operations based on the equipment that's on board or what equipment will be fitted prior to the voyage. In the same way for low air temperatures, same thing for ice. Under the Polar Code, at the latter stages of the Polar Code, the IMO developed a system called Polaris, which was a lot, mostly based on the Canadian Arctic ice regime shipping system. But it gives a methodology for people to evaluate the risk of their ice class in a specific ice regime. We take people through training on that, and that's a lot of the newcomers to the Arctic. As things are opening up and there's more mining activity, say in Baffinland, a bigger demand for ships, and Northern Sea Route transit, we're seeing increases there. The use of the Polaris system and understanding and making sure you've got the right equipment going into the area of the Arctic at the time of year you're looking to go there. That's our role there.
And Polaris is a tool that's functional and being used. And I want to turn the question to Anne near the end of the table about developing tools for operational tools for supporting decision making. How does NRC approach that, or how does Canada approach that? And are there any exciting products that you're looking to share soon?
Yeah, sure. I guess from a Canadian perspective, I was here at this event 2 years ago, and there certainly have been some changes in that period. So from a Canadian perspective, some new things that have come online that are influencing how we develop those tools and who we're working with. The Canadian government has been working very closely with its Indigenous, territorial, and provincial partners to develop its new Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. And that does influence how we do our research and who is doing that research. And it's a very collaborative approach, and it's taken a while to do that development, which is very new to our government. In addition to that, our Indigenous organizations like Inuit Teperet Kamatami have just come out with their National Inuit Strategy on research, as well as its corresponding implementation plan. Polar Knowledge Canada, one of our scientific agencies, their High Arctic Research Station, we're looking forward to it opening this year in Cambridge Bay, and they have a role of convening research and development. And not most recently, but I guess late last fall, the Canadian Coast Guard has also developed a new Arctic region, which takes into account all of Inuit Nunavut, which is a first for our regions within the Government of Canada, and that comprises up 50% of Canada's coastline, which is very extensive to begin with. So that's a huge amount of coastline, and all these things influence both how we do that research and where we're doing that type of research. So a lot of considerations that are coming into play are ensuring that we're collaborating with Indigenous and Inuit partners to make sure that needs and priorities of communities and governments are being taken into account. So when we look at, from an operational perspective of shipping, where are new marine protected areas going to be in place? Where are traditional hunting grounds? Where are low impact shipping corridors, places of refuge? How do we bring all that information together? And I talked a little bit about data, as we get more and more of this data in place, and big data. The Canadian Space Agency recently successfully launched the Radiosat Constellation mission. It's now in commissioning. As we get all this data and new tools in place, how do we bring all that together to create, research tools that can enable processing that data? So, there's the big words that we throw around a lot these days in terms of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So if you have tools and products like your company does, Leslie, in terms of, we get all this new remote sensing data, how can we incorporate that into physics-based models? So NRC has developed in the past a pack ice drift forecast, as well as the iceberg drift forecast, which is shared with IIP, who's here in the Canadian Ice Service. Those are physics-based models. What can we do with all this new data? How can we process it a little bit differently? How can we make it more real-time, faster, and enable new tools? Mm-hmm. And how can we, again, support risk assessments? That's another new tool we've been working on with the Canadian Coast Guard, the Canadian Arctic Risk Assessment, Shipping Risk Assessment System. Again, how do you enable people to be doing that planning with these high volumes of disparate data from all different locations and put it together comprehensively to support that sound decision making? Yeah,
sounds it's definitely a different perspective than our final panelist on the table, who's coming at it from a startup perspective. So Leslie, I'm going to pose the same question. How are you working to develop operational tools to support decision making or operations in the region?
Yeah, absolutely. Like Anne said, our company is working on using artificial intelligence, machine learning, to be able to rapidly ingest new data sets into our tools to be able to do like sea ice forecasting in a long-term kind of season planning. So that way it people are able to do logistics and understand kind of the risks associated with when they're operating. So traditionally, the modeling has been done through dynamical modeling, using formulas to explain a system, or statistical modeling, using the history to be able to predict what the system's going to, like the climate system is going to be able to do. And so these have some challenges when we don't understand the system, or if we have climate change and the system doesn't act the same as it used to. And so there's these big changes, and what we're predicting isn't what's happening. And so being able to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to ingest these new big data sets presents a great opportunity to be able to take those and ingest them. So the challenge with that is the artificial intelligence is typically a black box kind of answer. And so it's not going to give you the why that the scientific side really wants to know, but from a business perspective and an operation perspective, it's going to give you the what, when, and where.
Thank you very much. And it's nice to see that there are many ways to approach this problem, especially thinking about how rapidly the environment is changing. We have a few minutes left, and so if you have questions, I encourage you to come to the microphones. Is there a question over here?
Yes, ma'am. Hi.
Hi.
As a rising senior at the Merchant Marine Academy, there's always talk of the job market and the American flag fleet. So my question is kind of two-parted. One is, do you think that the Arctic will drastically increase the American flag fleet? And the second part of the question is, in school we have classes that certify us for being a person in charge of a tanker or SOLAS, multiple certifications, and should we start to include more certification in ice breaking and ice navigation as the Arctic becomes more relevant?
Before I pass it off to our panelists, I just want to point out that I really appreciate your question, because you've, as a mariner yourself or one who's in training, you've also underscored that the people are a part of this larger system. So thank you very much for your question, and I'm going to pass it to James, I think.
Thank you. And you've touched on an important thing, is the training. The crew, as Tim said, is a huge part of this, and the proper training for the crew is important. Under the Polar Code and STCW, what's STCW?
Ship training and watchkeeping certification.
Thank you. And watchkeeping.
Yep.
Yep, the watchkeeping. Speaking of which,
I don't
thank you
have
for
a
that.
watch. So anyway.
What was the question? Where were we going? Training.
U.S. flag.
U.S. flag and training. I'm not really qualified on the U.S. flag.
You can always
question.
rely on Mr. Bond, can't you?
Yes, thank you for.
Not on this occasion.
Certainly, government ships, Crowley and Voss are. American Holland, I think, is expanding their polar stuff. Expedition cruise ships, there's a lot of them being built right now and designed. And I think there is generally a lack of qualified people. So I encourage you. And the qualified people are, this age, right, Tim? My age.
A lot of them are. But if you're not only if you're interested in broadening your horizons, you don't need to only look at the American flag option.
Here we go.
There are opportunities to sail. We have a fleet of 63 ships that are a combination of only a few Canadian, 2 Canadian ships, a lot of Indian crewed ships, Ukrainian crewed ship, Filipino crewed ships, but there is a shortage in Canada of senior navigation officers. So there are opportunities, not necessarily on your national flag. And following on, under the Polar Code, you will be required to, if you are engaged in a bulk carrier, if you're operating on a bulk carrier, for example, and sailing in waters of more than 1/10 of ice, if you are the captain, you will need to have advanced certification and advanced training.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, and good luck with your studies at the Merchant Marine Academy. Is there a question over here?
Hi, my name's Dan Hubble. I'm from EIA. A couple of you probably know where my question's going to go. I wanted to thank you all for your time, and I was interested to hear what the panel's thoughts would be on implementing the environmental aspects of the Polar Code and at an operational level. Obviously, we can write all the regulations we like, but if the operators on board actually aren't doing anything, then it doesn't really come down to much.
That's a great question. Michael.
Good to see you, Dan. I've worked with the Arctic Council on a forum for the implementation of the Polar Code called the Arctic Shipping Best Practices Information Forum, established by the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, which aims to harness a collaborative approach so that all the inputs that are required for filling out polar water operational manuals, which are required to get a polar ship certificate, are adhered to, and that of course includes the environmental issues. And at this year's forum, the third forum, we had a very important slot for the environmental perspective and issues, of which Dan contributed to, so thank you for asking the question. But also being part of the answer. The environmental issues are extremely important. We've heard in presentations today about, particularly in the panel before the last one, of the indigenous communities' interests, mammal breeding grounds, and other areas of importance that need to be known for voyage planning. We have the, which is under Part 1 of the Polar Code. Under Part 2, we have all the environmental issues about oil and noxious substances and so on and so forth. And they are extremely important, and it's extremely important that they're adhered to by operators and understood by the decision makers in the process. The operators filling out a sensible polar water operation manual, the flag states, which isn't limited to Arctic's flag states. There are a number of flag states that have Arctic operating vessels under their flag. They need to be educated. The insurance industry who are approving these polar water operation manuals, and port state control. And also the finance industry who may be approving new projects and so on and so forth. So just to end there, environmental issues are extremely important, and working as a special advisor with the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, I can confirm that they are being taken extremely seriously by all 8 Arctic states in a collaborative effort.
But having said that, Michael, I think there's still a few issues on the table for everybody. Heavy fuel oil ban in Arctic waters is still under discussion. Gray water discharge is one that needs more discussion. And what else is on that list? Those are the 2 big ones. Air emissions is being covered off, I think, with the IMO 2020 and getting sulfur out of the fuels and out of the air emission stream. So, but black carbon, another issue, and maybe underwater noise gets added to that list.
Oh, sure.
Throw it in.
The other thing that needs to be considered in any of these, there's an obligation on the port state and to provide facilities as well. That's not being addressed yet. I think the environmental requirements of the Polar Code are not terribly onerous and are mirror much of what was going on in Canada, for example, for many years. So adhering to those is not, but if it goes further, if there's prohibitions on discharge of gray water and sewage, for example, then there has to be talk about how you deal with it and what do you do with it. And that's where the port states come into from a reception facility point of view.
Yeah, and sewage is always a great debate. Certainly from, I think the previous Canadian position was if you treated your sewage, then you had to not discharge it. If it was untreated, go ahead and discharge it. Which, for the amount of shipping, the number of people pooping, is, compared to the polar bears and everybody else, all the other
whales.
The whales, all the other, don't get them started on whales. All the other mammals up there, it was a drop in the bucket. But once you add chemicals into the mix, that's a problem. Don't discharge it. So, and under the Polar Code, you treat it, so no discharge.
Thank you all so much. I think that we are running out of time.
What makes you think that?
But I just want to say thank you to our panel. Oh.
Mike.
The co-chair of my advisory board would like to ask.
Mr. Reed Fredwell.
I think we can fit it in.
Just a quick question. We heard this morning that the National Weather Service may move into or join up with the National Ice Center. We saw Jackie's reports. I guess the question I have is for Leslie. What is the private opportunity for improved ice monitoring and ice forecasting, and what should the public ice forecasting be doing, and what are the gaps there, real fast? And anybody else on the panel?
Yeah, sure. So what we see from the private perspective is really that being able to plan those logistics and being able to understand the risks associated with that. A lot of the things that we've seen currently in the government and then the academia also is that they do a lot of science, they do a lot of these models, but what they don't provide is specific tailored products, or they don't translate it well for a business community. And so you have a lot of times where a business leader won't really understand what a Gaussian model is, but like you need somebody who can be able to translate that, be able to make it operational, and make it so that the people will be able to use it and be able to benefit from it. And so we really see ourselves as translating kind of the science to the business. And like the shipping industry, tourism, the insurance groups, everybody who needs to know more about the risks of operating there.
I can maybe add to that one other context is those tools need to be able to be used in the environment that they're being used in. And so we didn't really get into gaps and things like that, but certainly from a telecommunications standpoint, from a communication standpoint, if you're operating in the high north, what's your receptibility like? You're probably not going to be working off the cloud. So, how are you using that forecast? How are you getting those products? Like you say, they have to be tailored for the environment they're in which they're being used, rather than a desk in Washington or Ottawa.
Absolutely.
And in physically speaking, you need support systems in place, and it was very interesting to hear Senator Murkowski outlining the SEAL Act that's in play at the moment here in Washington, and with the support of Senator King and Senator Sullivan, and I believe a number of other senators. So that's something that will benefit safety and protection of the United States Coast Guard from being unnecessarily called out, as well as helping merchant shipping if it goes ahead. So I commend them for that effort, which is being looked at and watched very closely by the international maritime community and the insurance industry in London.
Thank you.
And I'm going to jump in just to add on top of that, of course, and basically say hats off to all the ice services around the world. It's not. There's a lot of art beyond science on interpreting the satellite imagery for ice, and from our perspective, we rely heavily on that expertise that's coming out of the various ice services, whether that's the National Ice Service in the U.S., NOAA, the Canadian Ice Service, DANES, the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute. We're using all of their data, and we do understand that it's processed data. It's turned into ice charts and the SIGRID data by experts, and hats off to them.
And it must continue to be free.
Yes. Don't take the Danish model of trying to charge me, please.
Mm-hmm. There was a clap for free. Okay. Please thank this wonderful panel. Thank you so much. Sarah, thank you. Sarah, I'm going to ask you to step down along with the panel, but then we're going to turn right back around and invite you back onto the stage. So as we make that switch, a nice transition to the next presentation, which will be done by Sarah, predicting maritime traffic in the United States Arctic. And this will be introduced by our good friend and colleague, Helen Brohl, the Executive Director of the United States Committee on Maritime Transportation System. Helen, welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Mike. So first thing, I know for me this is the time of day where I'd like to take a nap. So you don't have to show it, but take a deep breath. I suggest it so we can get some oxygen up into your brains, because we're going to give you a whirlwind of a report. And the thing I want you to take with you is the report is available for public comment. So if you remember anything, you're going to www.cmts.gov, G-O-V, C as in cat, M as in Mary, T as in Tom, S as in Sam.gov, because that's where you're going to find this report after Sarah's done, and I know you're going to want to read it and provide comment to us. So thank you again. It's just a pleasure to be here. We have a really great partnership with the Polar Institute and the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. We really appreciate that. And they directly contributed to the development of the report that Sarah's going to share with you. I'm Helen Brohl. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. Committee on the Marine Transportation System, or CMTS. We are an interdepartmental policy coordinating committee in the U.S. government. And what we do is herd all of the federal government agencies that deal with maritime transportation, and there are at least 25 of them. So those of you who work with the federal government a lot or are in the federal government, I know you know this. And you don't need us to help you get to those agencies, but you may find yourself at a quandary of where to go and talk to somebody about a particular issue. Please don't hesitate to contact us. So in 2010, the CMTS was directed by statute to coordinate transportation policy in the U.S. Arctic for safety and security. So that's why we're here today. At that initiation, we began looking at the maritime transportation system in the U.S. Arctic. What are the infrastructure requirements? How would you fund it through public-private partnerships? And made recommendations to make it a safer and more secure system. Today, Sarah's going to talk about, and she is our, was mentioned before, but she is our Senior Arctic Policy Advisor to the CMTS and lead author on an update of a report that we did in 2015. It is a 10-year projection of maritime activity in the U.S. Arctic. This one extends the projections out from 2020 to 2030. If you looked at the previous one, please go back to this one. It's far more granular, spent a lot more time on the analysis, and had a lot more stakeholder, non-federal stakeholder engagement. Many of you are in the audience, and we're grateful for that. So I know I'm running through it fast. She has 45 minutes of information to shove at you in 15 to 20 minutes. So remember, you can go back and look at this report at www.cmts.gov. So thank you, Sarah.
Hello again. As she mentioned, my name is SarahHarrison, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about our report, but there is much more in the actual report on our website, as Helen mentioned. And before I get started, I would be remiss if I did not say thank you to our partners across the federal government who have supported this work. So first and foremost, the U.S. Arctic Research Commission and Dr. John Farrell for his support and guidance. I'd also like to thank members of the CMTS's Arctic Marine Transportation Integrated Action Team. That's our interagency group that focuses on all things Arctic Marine Transportation System, as well as the CMTS Executive Secretariat, and then members of our, participants of our 2018 technical workshop that we hosted in conjunction with the U.S. Arctic Research Commission and the Woodrow Wilson Center, Woodrow Wilson Center's Polar Institute. So thank you to all of you. I know there are some participants in the audience, and so many, many thanks in advance. So as I set out this quest to begin thinking about the future of what Arctic marine transportation looked like, I realized there are a couple ways to go about doing this. First, we could use historical vessel data and extrapolate into the future and let math tell us what to expect in the year 2030. And this has some very obvious weaknesses in that it doesn't take into account how complex the system is, and we don't have a lot of data to base this off on. The U.S. Coast Guard has collected data going back to 2008 about the number of ships operating in the U.S. Arctic region, sort of north of the Bering Strait. But what about what's happening south of the Bering Strait? There's quite a lot. We could also use proxies for vessel activity, but the question is, what proxies do you use? Do you use the growth of the U.S. economy? Do you use the global economy, global shipping rates? The Arctic's a bit different than the rest of it, so what do you use? Some or all of them. And so what we decided to do was ask the experts. And that's exactly what we did at our workshop, as I mentioned before, that was held just last year. We had about 40 different participants from federal government, the Arctic marine shipping industry, as well as experts from the Arctic region to help inform our discussion. And we asked 3 simple questions, very straightforward, can't be complicated at all. What drives and is likely to drive vessel activity in the Arctic over the next decade? What are the most important of these drivers to consider? And how can these drivers be quantified and then incorporated into a projection to get us a number of ships by 2030? And to the answer to the first question of what drives vessel activity in the Arctic, the answer was too many things to fit onto a slide to be legibly read by audience out here. So this is just a small smattering of what was shared and discussed, and it ranges from everything of the price of oil to the demand for rare earth minerals to how well the Polar Code is implemented and adopted, and the demand for tourism, exotic cruise destinations to the top of the world. And if we bin these into different colored categories based on what kind of flavor of driver they are, we see that it's not all just one thing. It's not all natural resources. It's not all the global economy. And it's not all infrastructure and technology. It's a mixture of all of these things. And so we then asked our participants, okay, so what's really, really important? All of these things might play a role, but what is the most important for us to consider? And so on this axis, we have along the x-axis, we have the perceived probability of how large of an impact is this particular factor going to have on vessel activity. So our example earlier was the price of oil reaching over $100 a barrel. Say that's a driver. If that happens, how large of an impact would that have? And then would plot it on the x. And then what is the probability that would actually happen? How likely is our y scale here? And as you can see, again, it's a rainbow plot of all kinds of things with no discernible trends from what we got from our participants. And so the take-home message was, it's not one, but many factors drive vessel activity now and in the future. That's great, but it doesn't move us any closer to building projections into the future. And so what we then did was take a look at the long list our participants had given us. It was about 70 different factors, and we looked at them with fresh eyes, and we narrowed down this list to 29 individual pieces that will contribute growth in terms of number of vessels. That we could go back and find plans for a specific project or a specific icebreaker and say, this is going to add 2 ships, this is going to add 10 ships every year for the next decade. And these drivers really fell into 4 different categories, which I'm going to walk through with you all today. The first is natural resource development, infrastructure development, the expansion of the Arctic fleet of vessels that are designed specifically to operate in the Arctic, and then a number of vessels that might use the Arctic for transoceanic shipping, sort of be rerouted through the Arctic. So first up are our natural resources. Natural resources have long played a role in the Arctic's narrative and in the past, and we expect that this is going to be true in the years to come. And so we took a look, as you can see on this image here, I don't think I have a laser pointer, but the black line is our study's area of interest. And so when I say the Arctic region, I'm really talking about the waters, the Polar Code region of near the U.S. side, in the Bering Sea, Beaufort Sea and Chukchi Sea, and extending beyond the U.S. territorial waters. And the natural resource projects that we really were looking at included oil and gas development, and mostly oil development within the US, gas development in Russia, as we heard about from our panel earlier today, as well as mineral development in the US and Canada. And while some of these minerals might be airlifted out, say if they're being mining gold or platinum, which are very, very valuable and very, very small, the annual sea lift required to supply that mine with equipment, with fuel, it's all going to come in via ship. And so keeping track of those and thinking about which ones are likely to come through this area of interest, we factored into our projections. We also thought about infrastructure development, and this is sort of a broad and nebulous category, but we broke it into 3 different pieces. And the first is infrastructure development that is directly related to the marine transportation system. So the figure on your right is the tentatively selected plan from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers modification study for the Port of Nome. And this is a project that will require vessels to come and dredge the port and bring in riprap and all sorts of things. So we factored into, that was one example. And then there's also projects that are going to require, that are not related to marine transportation directly once they're finished, but they're going to require a sea lift to be built in the first place. Western and northern Alaska is not like the rest of the US. You cannot put concrete on a truck and haul it in to build the project you want to build. You have to barge it in or ship it in. And the fuel required to operate those machines, you also need to ship in. And so we looked at the state of Alaska and the different projects that are proposed and underway and being planned right now that will have a sea lift requirement or element to them. And so this is an example of an 11-mile road connecting Kotzebue to Cape Blossom in Alaska. And the final piece of infrastructure that we considered was sort of the infrastructure redevelopment or relocation or armament that's required to help our communities along the coast as they prepare for a rapidly changing environment. This is an image of a breach in the Kivalina seawall in 2003. Coastal erosion, riverine erosion, and permafrost thaw are all very real things and very real threats to infrastructure in the U.S. Arctic and the wider Arctic. And so how you prepare an armament for this is this is an example where riprap was hauled in as part of a project to protect and fortify the coastline in Kivalina. And so as the environment changes, we anticipate that more of these ships are going to be required to come in and either prepare in place communities or relocate or in some cases build evacuation routes for communities. Another element of growth that we considered for our projections were the ships that are designed and being built to purpose to operate in the Arctic. And so we considered a wide variety of icebreakers, first and foremost being the Coast Guard polar security cutters that are planned to be delivered within the next decade, as well as the Russian icebreaking fleet and Canadian icebreaking fleet, and the Chinese research vessel, the Shulong 2, which launches this year. And if it's anything like its sister, she will be operating in this area. But we also looked at the new cruise and adventure ships that are on order. Not all of these ships are definitely going to operate in this neighborhood of the Arctic, but they might. And so in our scenarios, we imagined that different pieces of these would be moving through our area of interest. And then finally, the last piece of growth we considered was an adaptation from something in our 2015 report where we estimated the number of ships that would utilize the Arctic as another way to transit goods, transocean shipment. And so we used data from the Northern Sea Route, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal to estimate how large a fraction this could be. And we limited it to the type of ships that are the ships that are the right type, the right size. They can't be, the draft limitations of the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage do not allow for your very, very large ships to pass through, and also the right season. It only makes sense if you're not going to be a specifically dedicated ice-breaking ship. You're only going to move through in the region in the navigational window from July to, say, November or so. And so what we did is we brought all these pieces together. So the vessels used for natural resource development, for infrastructure development, redevelopment, however you want to call it, vessels that are joining the Arctic fleet, and then vessels that would happen to pass through the Arctic as they are rerouted through the Arctic. And this gives us a total number of additional vessels to expect each year for the next decade. We take that, and we add it to the number of vessels that are currently in the region, and that gives us the total number of ships we expect to have every year in the Arctic. And as I mentioned, we looked at this 4 different ways in imagining different scenarios under which vessels would be operating. And these 4 scenarios that are featured in the report are a reduced activity scenario, which imagines that we are going to sort of put our foot on the brakes in development. And then the most plausible scenario, which is our most stable, the scenario we see is most likely to occur. And the optimized growth scenario, which is a little bit faster, and then finally the accelerated but unlikely scenario, which we developed as a ceiling for our projections of if we throw everything into the basket and we go as fast as we can, how many ships do we have? And what I want to take the final moments I have with you all is to discuss the results of our most plausible scenario, and that's that orange line that you see here. And where we stand right now with this data is we can look back at the last decade, and the rate of growth has been tremendous. And looking forward under the most plausible scenario, we expect that the growth will continue, but maybe not as fast as it has grown. So the number of vessels in this scenario is likely to be about 50% higher than the present levels, which is a pretty astounding growth rate for any kind of region, but it's not as fast as it possibly could be, and as fast as it has been in the last decade. And the other elements I want to leave you all with is that of these additional vessels that we're throwing into the mix, over half of them are expected to be related to natural resource development. And of those, most of those are non-US related projects. Vessels rerouted through the Arctic will continue to climb. We can't, there are definitely operational considerations that were mentioned by the panel before me and that Lawson teed up for us in our first panel of this afternoon session. But we expect that this will continue to grow. And this past couple of years, it's been about 14 or so vessels. And so we can see that to continue to grow to about maybe 30 or so by the end of the next century, or next decade, excuse me. And then we also expect there to be more adventure cruise ships in the area than ever before. It's an exciting place to go, and we expect more tourists to keep visiting it. But the final element that I want to leave you all with is that the marine transportation system in the Arctic is likely to continue serving as a vital role in supporting infrastructure and repairing infrastructure in the Alaskan region. It's also a key element to bracing our northernmost part of the U.S. to bracing that region to climate change, because it is changing more rapidly and our infrastructure is at risk. So with that, I know it's been a whirlwind of a report, and I really appreciate that I'm your time and attention. And the draft of this report is available on our website, www.cmts.gov. We are requesting comments on this draft on or before July 31st, which is rapidly approaching. And we expect to release this final report on our website in September of this year. So with that, I hope I have a few questions, times for questions, so. Okay. No.
Okay, thank you. I know, I'm being a Scrooge on the question thing, only because it's break time. And that's not the only reason. But Sarah, thank you for doing double duty, moderating and the perfect fit with the report. Thank you very much. Helen, thank you so very much. We have a break now of 2:40 to 3 o'clock. At 3 o'clock, please be back promptly. It'll be a fantastic panel on great power competition in the Arctic led by Dr. Rebecca Pincus. Thank you, 3 o'clock.